The docking procedure was automatic, as usual. I stared out the small viewport of the shuttle, watching Io's barren, sulfur-stained surface spread out beneath us like a wasteland. There wasn't much to look at: cracked rock, deep gouges, and the occasional flash of volcanic activity in the distance. In a way, it was beautiful, untouched. It made sense to me. The geology here had a kind of purity to it. No atmosphere to erode it, no life to interfere. Just rock and time. The shuttle bumped lightly as it connected to the landing station's airlock. I glanced over at Finch, who stood near the hatch, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He always looked like he was expecting trouble, though there was little to worry about here. Finch had been with me on 2 previous missions, and while I trusted him to handle any security issues, I didn't think we'd need much protection here. It wasn't like there were any life forms to shoot. "All good on your end?" Finch asked, his voice a gravelly tone that always sounded slightly irritated, even when it wasn't. I nodded. "Just another rock," I said. "A big one, sure, but it's still just geology." Behind me, Dr. Peter Holt had already stood up, fumbling with his gear. He was a biologist, which meant his excitement about the moons was more theoretical. He believed there could be signs of some sort of life beneath Io's surface, some microbe or extremophile that had adapted to the moon's volcanic activity. Personally, I thought he was chasing shadows. Still, I respected his drive. Holt was a man who'd see life in a vacuum if it suited him. "Ready to see what's down there?" Holt grinned, his enthusiasm nearly overwhelming. I forced a smile. "Sure, let's just hope it doesn't burn us alive." Finch keyed the airlock, and a mechanical hiss followed as the doors opened. We stepped into the corridor that connected the shuttle to the main research facility. It was a simple setup. Metal walls, low ceilings, and a constant noise of life support systems working overtime to keep us breathing, in an atmosphere that didn't care whether we lived or died. The rest of the team was already waiting for us in the operations center. Sloan, the communications officer, sat at his usual station, staring at the various screens. He seemed preoccupied, and he hadn't bothered to greet us when we entered. That wasn't unusual for Sloan. He was a quiet man, always more comfortable with tech than people. "Everything functional?" I asked. Sloan grunted. "Yeah, mostly. Been getting some weird signal interference since last night, though. Could be the volcanic activity, but I don't know. It's strange." He glanced at me briefly, then back at his screens. I didn't push it. Sloan always saw things in his equipment that no one else did. Finch stood near the door, arms crossed, surveying the room like a soldier at attention. I dropped my bag onto one of the tables. "All right, let's keep this simple. We've got a 6-month window before the next rotation, and our focus is the subsurface analysis near the vent fields. We've already received some reports from Europa about strange activity, but there's no reason to assume we'll see the same here." I looked at Holt, who was already unpacking his samples and equipment with a kind of fevered focus. "Peter, you can start your surveys once the initial scans come back. I'm more interested in getting data from the geothermal activity first." Holt nodded absently, already lost in his own world. That was fine with me. I preferred him that way. Quiet, busy, not asking too many questions. Sloan turned in his chair. "I've got everything set up for the data link back to Earth, but we're running into interference whenever we try to reach Europa. Like I said earlier, it could just be the distance and the environment, but..." He trailed off, staring at his screen again, his fingers tapping nervously at the console. "We'll worry about that later," I said, cutting him off. "For now, let's focus on getting our data collected. Everything else can wait." The rest of the day passed without much fanfare. Holt was out on the surface within an hour, running his own tests, while Finch and I stayed inside, monitoring the seismographs. I watched the data come in, noting minor tremors and shifts beneath Io's surface. The numbers made sense. Everything was within expected parameters. Later that night, I met Finch in the mess hall. We were the only two there. The others were either still working or resting in their quarters. I poured a cup of the station's lousy coffee and sat down across from him. "Something doesn't feel right," Finch muttered, staring into his own drink. I raised an eyebrow. "What? The coffee?" "Yeah, it tastes like dirt." Finch shot me a glare. "I'm serious. This place, it feels off." I took a sip of my coffee, not responding immediately. Finch wasn't the type to get spooked easily, and hearing him say something like that wasn't exactly comforting. "You're just not used to the quiet," I said eventually. He didn't answer, just stared at his cup. I was about to say something else when the lights dimmed, just for a second. It was enough to send a cold chill down my spine, but I ignored it. "Must be the volcanic activity messing with the grid," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. But Finch just looked at me, eyes hard. "Or it's something else." Morning came too quickly. The station lights switched on, dull and lifeless. I rolled out of my bunk and headed to the operations center. The place was quiet. Sloan was already at his station, staring at the screens like he always did. I nodded to him, though he didn't bother looking up. I checked the usual data: geothermal readings, seismic activity, surface conditions. Everything looked normal. That was the problem. Nothing ever happened out here, just volcanic rock and empty sky. I glanced over at Sloan. "Everything all right?" He shrugged without looking away from his console. "Yeah, I guess. Just some minor interference in the comms last night, but it cleared up. Probably nothing." Probably nothing. That was starting to sound like our mission motto. "Holt already out?" Sloan nodded. "He left about an hour ago. Said something about getting early samples near the vent fields." That tracked. Holt was always eager to get a head start, especially when it came to the more dangerous fieldwork. The man had a single-minded obsession with finding signs of life in the most inhospitable places imaginable. Part of me respected it. Another part of me thought he was looking for ghosts. I grabbed a cup of the station's bitter coffee and leaned against the wall, watching the slow scroll of data across the monitors. The minutes ticked by. Finch hadn't checked in yet, which wasn't like him, but I figured he was just doing his rounds. Another hour passed. I watched as the geothermal readings spiked slightly. Nothing unusual, just typical volcanic activity. Holt's location pinged on the map. He was further out than I'd expected, near the northern vent field. It was a dangerous spot, but Holt had insisted that was where the most interesting samples were. Another ping. Finch's location finally showed up. He was closer to the western perimeter, moving slower than usual. "Hold on," Sloan muttered, frowning at his screen. I moved closer, peering over his shoulder. He tapped a few keys, zooming in on Finch's location. "What's the problem?" I asked, setting my cup down. "Finch isn't moving. He's just standing there." I frowned. Finch wasn't the kind of guy to stop for no reason, especially not in the middle of his patrol. I grabbed the radio and keyed in his frequency. "Finch, you copy?" Static crackled back at me. I tried again, this time with a little more urgency. "Finch, this is Tate, check in." More static. Sloan shook his head. "I've got nothing. His vitals look normal, but he's just standing there. Same spot for the last 5 minutes." It wasn't like Finch to go radio silent, and it definitely wasn't like him to just stand still in the middle of a patrol. I toggled the comms again, this time broadcasting to Holt. "Holt, do you copy?" A moment passed before his voice came through, slightly garbled but clear enough. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "Finch isn't responding. He's out near the west perimeter, but he's been stationary for a while. I'm going out to check on him." Holt's voice crackled in the static. "You want me to meet you there?" "No, stay where you are," I replied. "I'll handle it. Just keep an eye on your surroundings, all right?" "Roger that," he said, though I could hear the edge of curiosity in his tone. Holt loved a mystery. I clipped my radio back onto my belt and headed for the airlock, pulling on my suit. The world outside was still, the sharp rocks and volcanic plains untouched by anything human. The horizon was marred only by the occasional cloud of sulfuric gas drifting from distant vents. No sounds but the steady hum of my suit's environmental systems. filtering the air and maintaining pressure as I stepped into the alien terrain. Finch's location was a good 20-minute walk from the station, but the terrain was mostly flat. I trudged through the dusty, sulfur-streaked surface, my boots kicking up faint plumes of sulfuric dust as I went. 10 minutes in, I tried the radio again. "Finch, you copy?" Nothing but static. I picked up the pace, my breath coming faster in the sealed suit. The ridge came into view, but there was no sign of him. The HUD on my visor showed his location just ahead, but when I rounded the ridge, the area was empty. Finch's marker still pinged on the map, but he wasn't here. I stopped, scanning the horizon. No movement, just the endless, barren landscape. Then something caught my eye. A faint disturbance in the dust, like footprints leading away from the ridge, deeper into the rocky plains. I followed them, my pulse quickening. He was moving away from his assigned patrol, heading toward one of the vent fields. The heat from the vents was enough to cook a person alive if they got too close. I toggled the radio again, frustration creeping into my voice. "Finch, where the hell are you?" More static. I followed the tracks for another 10 minutes, the terrain becoming rougher as I approached the vent field. The sulfuric gas was thicker here. It didn't make sense for Finch to be out here. This wasn't his sector. Finally, I saw him. He was standing near the edge of a large vent, his back to me, facing the rocky plain. His suit was intact, the lights on his back blinking steadily, but he wasn't moving. "Finch!" I called out, my voice echoing in my helmet. No response. I approached slowly. "Finch, it's Tate. What are you doing out here?" He didn't move. I stepped closer, close enough to see his hands hanging limply at his sides. His helmet was tilted slightly downward, like he was staring at the ground. I reached out and grabbed his shoulder. I shook him gently, trying to snap him out of whatever trance he was in. His body swayed slightly but stayed upright. I stepped in front of him, peering into his helmet. His eyes were open, wide and staring, but they didn't see me. His face was expressionless. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there, frozen in place, as if something had shut him down from the inside. "Finch," I muttered, shaking him harder now. "Come on, man. Wake up." He didn't respond. His vitals were still showing up on my HUD. Heartbeat slow but steady, oxygen levels normal. But he wasn't there. It felt like he had been erased, with only his body occupying space. I stepped back. This wasn't right. None of this made sense. I fumbled for my radio. "Sloan, I've got a problem. Finch is... I don't know. He's unresponsive. I need you to get Holt back here. We need help." The static crackled. Then Sloan's voice came through, tight with confusion. "What do you mean, unresponsive?" "I mean, he's standing here like a damn statue. He's breathing, but he's not moving, not talking. Something's wrong." A long pause, then Sloan spoke again, quieter this time. "I'll get Holt. Be careful, Tate." I stared at Finch's lifeless form, still standing there, motionless. His eyes, wide and vacant, seemed to bore through me. But I knew he wasn't seeing anything. It was as if he had been shut off, his body breathing, his heart beating, but his mind had vacated. I shook him one last time, hoping for some kind of reaction, but nothing happened. "Sloan, where's Holt?" I barked into the radio. Static crackled for a moment before Sloan responded, his voice jittery. "He's on his way, but you need to get Finch inside. Do you need me out there?" "No, stay at your post, I'll handle it." I turned back to Finch, trying to figure out how I was going to get him to move. I took him by the shoulders and pulled him away from the vent field, but he remained limp, dead weight in my arms. It was like dragging a sandbag. I paused for a moment, weighing my options. We were too far from the station for me to carry him alone, but I couldn't leave him here either. "Holt better hurry," I muttered to myself. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, glancing nervously at the vent, the surface around us still and eerily quiet. I didn't want to think about what was happening to Finch or why he was like this. It didn't make sense. His vitals were still registering as normal, but there was no life behind his eyes. In the distance, I saw a figure moving toward us. Holt. He was carefully making his way across the uneven terrain in a slow manner. His movements were measured, the low gravity making each step more of a controlled hop than a walk. His gear was bulky and secured tightly to his suit, and he moved cautiously, making sure not to lose balance on the rocky surface. As he got closer, I could see his head turning slowly, scanning the horizon, probably as unnerved as I was. When he finally reached us, his face was tight with concern. "What the hell happened?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "One minute he's fine, doing his rounds. The next he's just gone, like this." I gestured toward Finch. Holt bent down and inspected Finch's visor. "His vitals look steady," he said, puzzled. "How long has he been like this?" "About an hour. Since I found him, he hasn't moved or said a word." Holt stood up, wiping the dust off his gloves. "We need to get him inside, fast. If we can't figure this out here, maybe we can do something back at the station." Together we maneuvered Finch's limp form between us, using the stabilization systems in our suits to help balance his weight in the low gravity. Even though Io's gravity made him lighter, the bulk of his suit and gear made it awkward to move him. As we approached the station, the airlock cycled open, and Sloane's voice came through the comms again, this time strained. "Get him inside. I've been monitoring some weird signals, but they're getting worse." We hauled Finch into the decontamination chamber and secured him to a bench. Once inside, Holt removed Finch's helmet, revealing his expressionless face. His eyes were still wide open, staring blankly into space, his skin cold to the touch. I shuddered, not from the cold, but from the way he looked, like he wasn't even human anymore. We all stared at Finch for a few moments, waiting for something to happen. As if on cue, Finch's body convulsed, a small, violent jerk like a muscle spasm. Holt and I took a step back, startled. "Finch!" I called out more forcefully this time. He didn't answer, but his body jerked again. His head snapped to one side, and a horrible gurgling noise came from his throat. His chest heaved violently, and his eyes rolled back into his head. We were frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Then, his skin started to change, dark lines forming just beneath the surface, like veins, except they were pitch black. They spread quickly, snaking across his face and down his neck, until his entire upper body was crisscrossed with the dark, spider-webbed lines. His skin looked like it was being consumed from the inside out. "What the hell is happening to him?" Holt whispered, stepping back in horror. Finch's body convulsed one last time before slumping forward, completely still. The black veins were stark against his pale skin, and his breathing had stopped. He was dead. Holt and I stood there for a moment, silent, staring at what used to be Finch. I was trying to wrap my head around what had just happened when Sloane's voice came through the comms, sharp and panicked. "Guys, we've got another problem." "What now?" I snapped, barely able to tear my eyes away from Finch's corpse. "You're not going to like this. We just lost contact with one of the other teams. They were outside when it happened." I looked at Holt, whose face had gone pale. The weight of what was happening hit us both at once. This wasn't an isolated event. Something was spreading, and we were completely unprepared for it. "We need to quarantine the station," I said, my voice tight. Whatever was happening, it was spreading fast, and if we didn't act quickly, we'd be next. Holt and I moved through the station, keeping our focus on getting answers. There wasn't time to waste, and we knew it. When we reached the operations center, Sloane was at his console, tapping furiously at the keys. "Holt! Tate!" Sloane muttered. "We've got bigger problems." "Talk to us," Holt said, stepping forward, his voice tight with barely contained panic. Sloane gestured to one of the screens. "I've been monitoring the interference we've been experiencing for the past few days. It's not random. There's a pattern to it." "What do you mean, a pattern?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "It's like the interference is being directed." Sloane continued, his voice quickening. "At first, I thought it was just the volcanic activity messing with our equipment, but look." He pointed to a series of waveforms on the screen. "It's too consistent. It's almost like a signal, Something's trying to communicate. Communicate? Holt repeated. From where? Sloane shrugged, exasperated. That's the thing. I don't know. But it's coming from beneath the surface of the moon, deeper than any of our sensors can reach. The comms are picking it up, but it's not anything we've seen before. It's intelligent. Holt and I exchanged a glance, neither of us wanting to acknowledge what that meant. So you're telling us the moon is, what, alive? I asked, incredulous. I don't know if it's the moon itself, but something down there is aware of us. It's been watching us, listening, and I think it's been doing a lot more than that. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was piling up. Finch's death wasn't an accident, and whatever had taken him was part of something bigger, something worse than we had imagined. We need to shut down all field operations, Holt said. Bring everyone back inside and isolate the station. We can't risk anyone else being exposed to whatever this is. Sloane nodded, sending out orders to the remaining teams. I leaned against the wall, thoughts swirling in my head. The idea that something down there, something beneath the surface, was actively hunting us, digesting us like we were prey, was too much to process. This was supposed to be a research mission. We were scientists, not soldiers. We weren't prepared for this. We've lost too many already, Holt muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. We have to figure out what's going on. Are you suggesting we try to make contact, after what happened to Finch? Holt looked at me, his eyes hard. I'm suggesting we don't have much of a choice. If we don't figure out what this thing wants, we're all going to end up like Finch. The thought made my skin crawl, but I knew Holt was right. We were cornered. Whatever was down there, it wasn't going to stop. Not until it had finished what it started. I'll start running diagnostics on the remaining samples, Holt said. There has to be something in the data, something we've missed. If we can find out what triggers the process, maybe we can stop it. I watched him go, his back stiff with determination. Holt was persistent when it came to solving problems. But this wasn't just another puzzle. This was a fight for survival, and there was no guarantee that the answers he found would save us. Sloane remained at his station. He looked drained, haunted, but his hands moved with focus as he worked to seal off the station and get everyone inside. A loud burst of static erupted from the comms, making us both jump. What was that noise? I muttered, moving toward the console. Sloane quickly adjusted the controls, trying to clear the interference, but the static didn't go away. It amplified, as if it were pushing through from some distant place. Then, through the noise, we heard a deep, harsh sound that made my heart race. I've been picking this up for the last hour, Sloane said. It's been getting worse. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the signal, but the longer I listened, the more unsettling it became. This wasn't a random phenomenon. This was communication. Alien, aggressive, and unmistakably hostile. Sloane looked up at me. Whatever this is, it's coming for us. I couldn't argue with him. The signs were all there, and they were closing in fast. We had no idea how much time we had left, but one thing was clear. We weren't alone here. Something down there had found us, and it wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. Holt's voice came over the intercom. Tate, Sloane, get down to the lab. I found something in Finch's blood. You need to see this. I turned to Sloane, my stomach twisting in knots. Let's go. When we reached the lab, Holt was standing over the microscope, his face grim. What did you find? I asked, stepping closer. Holt gestured toward the screen. Finch's blood wasn't infected. It was altered. Whatever killed him didn't shut down his body. It rewrote it. What do you mean, rewrote it? Sloane asked, his voice shaking. Holt pointed at the dark veins visible on the screen. This isn't a toxin. This is a biological transformation. It's like his cells were being repurposed by whatever is down there. I stared at the screen, horrified. Finch hadn't been killed. He'd been consumed. We're dealing with something alive, Holt said. Something that isn't just trying to kill us. It's trying to use us. Holt stood over the microscope, his eyes fixed on the screen showing Finch's altered blood cells. The dark veins had spread so thoroughly it was hard to believe this had been a man just hours ago. I stared at the monitor, trying to wrap my head around it, but Holt's words kept replaying in my mind. It's using us. The station felt claustrophobic. The comms had gone completely haywire since the last signal spike, and there was still no contact from the other teams outside. We were cut off, and it was only a matter of time before whatever was beneath reached us too. "We need to make a decision," Holt said, breaking the silence. "If we stay here, we're done. We need to get to the evacuation shuttle." I looked at Sloan. His fingers twitched as he stared at the screens. "Do we even know if it's safe to leave?" "We don't have much choice. If we stay, we'll end up like Finch." Holt nodded, already moving toward the door. "Let's gear up. We need to be ready for anything." We didn't waste time. In the back of my mind, I knew this was likely a last-ditch effort, but the thought of waiting around for whatever had taken Finch to come for us wasn't an option. We moved quickly through the corridors toward the armory, focused and silent. Holt, Sloan, and I suited up, methodically securing our gear, which seemed heavier than usual. There wasn't much to say. We all knew what was at stake. Once we were ready, we proceeded through the station toward the airlock. Every now and then, I thought I heard something in the walls. A faint clicking, like metal scraping against metal. But I ignored it. Whatever was out there, we had to make it to the shuttle before it got to us. Sloan kept glancing at the comm panel embedded in his suit, but the signal was dead. We were moving blind. The station's lights dimmed as we passed through the final bulkhead leading to the hangar. The power grid was struggling to stay online, the interference from beneath the surface messing with everything. I didn't like the thought of what might happen if it failed completely. The airlock opened, and we stepped out onto the surface. The shuttle wasn't far, just over a ridge about half a kilometer away. Holt led the way, his shoulders tense, his eyes locked on the path ahead. Sloan followed, his head down, watching his step. I brought up the rear, glancing back at the station every few steps. Halfway to the ridge, the ground shook. We stopped dead in our tracks, the tremor rumbling beneath our feet. I steadied myself, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, and that's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just the play of shadows on the horizon, tricks of the light against the volcanic ridges. But there they were, bodies, standing motionless against the dark backdrop of Io's barren landscape. Finch was among them, his outline unmistakable, though there was no helmet, no suit. Just his body, skin blackened and cracked, like burned stone. Behind him, more of the crew we had lost, standing in a crooked line, slowly advancing. Their eyes were empty pits, their skin cracked and blackened like ash. They moved awkwardly, their feet barely lifting off the ground, as if being pulled forward by some unseen force. I blinked hard, my breath catching in my throat. "Do you see that?" I whispered. Holt nodded. "It's them. Or what's left of them." For a moment I wondered if it was a hallucination, another one of the moon's tricks. But deep down I knew this wasn't our minds playing tricks. The moon was doing this. We picked up the pace, practically running across the rocky terrain. The shuttle came into view, its sleek hull reflecting the dim light of Jupiter's distant glow. Relief washed over me, brief, fleeting, until I saw the airlock. It was open. Something had beaten us to the shuttle. Sloan was the first to reach it. He stopped at the base of the ramp, his breath coming in panicked bursts. "The hell is this?" We rushed up behind him, and the answer was clear. The airlock door had been forced open, its control panel sparking faintly where it had been ripped apart. Inside, the shuttle was dark, the emergency lights glowing intermittently. "We can still use it," Holt said. "If we can get the power back online, we can launch." We hurried inside, moving through the cramped interior to the cockpit. The damage wasn't as bad as it looked. Just the exterior controls had been sabotaged. Inside, everything was still functional, but the power was fluctuating. Sloane moved to the console, rerouting the energy flow. Holt and I stood guard, watching the narrow corridor that led to the shuttle's engine room. Every second that passed felt too long. "Hurry up," I muttered. "I'm trying," Sloane shot back, his voice tense. "It's not responding properly. Something's interfering with the power circuits." I turned to Holt. "Check the engine room, make sure nothing's damaged." Holt nodded and disappeared down the corridor, leaving me with Sloane. The shuttle felt too quiet, too still. I scanned the shadows, half expecting something to lunge out of them. Then a loud crash came from the back of the shuttle. "Holt!" I called out. No answer. I glanced at Sloane. "Stay here. Keep working." I reached the engine room and found Holt standing still, staring at something on the ground. "Tate," he whispered. I moved closer and saw what he was looking at. A missing crew member was lying on the floor, body twisted and broken, the black veins snaking up his arms and neck. His face was frozen in terror, eyes wide and lifeless. "Get back to the cockpit, now!" Holt didn't need to be told twice. He bolted back down the corridor, leaving me standing there, staring at the body. Whatever had killed him could still be active in his body, or worse, it could wake up just like Finch. I couldn't risk it. I crouched down, grabbed the limp form by the shoulders, and began dragging him toward the airlock. His body was heavy and awkward, the veins crawling up his arms like cracks in old plaster. I couldn't help but glance at his face, those lifeless eyes wide with fear. Once I reached the airlock, I activated the door. The cold blast of Io's atmosphere hit as the hatch opened. I hauled the body through and dumped it outside. For a second I stood there, staring at it lying there on the moon's surface like it belonged there, part of the desolation. I didn't wait for anything to happen. I sealed the airlock and hurried back to the cockpit. When I reached it, Sloane had finally managed to get the power back online. The shuttle came to life, and the control panel lit up with a soft green glow. "We're good to go," Sloane said, breathless. "Let's get the hell out of here." Holt and I strapped in, and Sloane initiated the launch sequence. The shuttle's engines roared, and we lifted off the surface, the volcanic plains shrinking below us. I watched the station disappear into the distance, a cold pit forming in my stomach. The shuttle touched down on Earth, its landing gear screeching against the reinforced tarmac of the quarantine zone. We had barely left Io's atmosphere when the emergency protocols kicked in. The transmission we sent out had been enough to set off alarms back home, and by the time we crossed into Earth's orbit, they were waiting for us. We were met with a full team: doctors, military personnel, and an army of researchers in biohazard suits, all prepared to deal with whatever we brought back. Holt, Sloane, and I were immediately separated. The shuttle itself was sealed and carted away to some undisclosed location for decontamination and study. No one told us what was going on outside the walls of our quarantine chambers. The isolation was absolute. For 2 weeks, I didn't see anyone besides the medics and researchers who checked on me through thick, transparent walls. Their voices transmitted through the intercoms, muffled and distant like I was hearing them from the bottom of a deep well. They prodded me with tests, blood work, scans, psych evaluations, looking for any trace of what had happened to Finch and the others. Any sign that I had brought it back with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blackened veins snaking up his arms, his eyes empty and lifeless, but his body still standing. I told them everything in the debriefs, every detail I could remember. They listened, recorded, and wrote everything down, but they didn't believe me. Not at first. Then reports from Europa started coming in. It had been months since the last transmission from the research team on Europa. The last anyone heard, there had been strange malfunctions with their comms equipment, but nothing unusual enough to cause alarm, until they went dark. The official word had been that it was a technical failure, the icy conditions interfering with communication, but deep down we all suspected something else. We just didn't know what. The investigation team pieced it together bit by bit. Europa wasn't silent. It was consumed by the same thing that had taken Finch. Black veins, empty eyes. Those who disappeared came back the same way. The same twisted, broken bodies wandering the ice plains, eyes vacant, only to collapse hours later. The moons had digested them, the same way Io had done to Finch. Io and Europa were linked in ways we hadn't realized. The same force had risen beneath both surfaces, consuming anything human. The military debriefing was brief and clinical, no room for speculation. They spoke in careful, measured tones, dissecting the events as if they were reading from a textbook. Anomalous activity detected. Extraterrestrial influence suspected. But no one wanted to admit the truth out loud, not officially. Earth couldn't handle the idea that the moons of Jupiter were sentient, that they had intelligence, and that intelligence was hostile. Instead, the mission was quietly labeled as a failure, and the official cause of death for the crew was environmental exposure. The public didn't know the whole story. They never would. What happened on Io and Europa would be buried in classified files, locked away from the rest of humanity. The space program was halted indefinitely, and any future exploration beyond Earth was scrapped. The risks were too great, the unknowns too vast. No one was willing to gamble with the lives of more crews, not after what had happened to us. Months passed in quarantine, even after the tests came back clean. They had to be sure. The doctors poked and prodded, searching for any sign of the black veins, any trace of the moon's influence in our bodies. But whatever had infected Finch and the others never crossed into us. When I was finally released from quarantine, the world felt distant. The sun seemed dimmer, the air too suffocating. I'd spent so long under harsh lights, confined to a small room, that being outside felt foreign. Sloan didn't make it. He couldn't handle the quarantine. The isolation broke him. He started seeing things, talking to the walls, convinced that the moon's influence had followed us back. One night he just stopped responding to the medics, and by the morning they found him dead in his chamber. They said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. He wasn't infected, but the fear had consumed him. Holt was different. He buried himself in the data, trying to make sense of it all. He couldn't let it go, couldn't stop looking for an explanation. He believed there was a way to understand what had happened on Io and Europa, that if we just looked harder, studied more, we'd find the answer. But there was no answer. The moons didn't play by the rules of our science, and I knew Holt would never accept that. As for me, I left the program. They offered me a desk job, a chance to stay in the field as a consultant. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't sit behind a screen and pretend that everything was normal, that what we encountered out there was just another anomaly to be catalogued and forgotten. I wanted nothing to do with it anymore. The stars had lost their shine. The moons of Jupiter weren't barren. They were aware, and they had made it clear humans weren't welcome. We were invaders, and they had fought back. Whatever we awakened on Io and Europa was still out there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the next crew foolish enough to venture too close. The investigation wrapped up quietly, the findings sealed away. We may have escaped, but we didn't win. The moons had spoken and they weren't done yet.